Hello everyone, this is podfic, back with another podfic. Today I'll be reading The Cruel Palace by I Did It for the Lol. This is part 3, chapter 3. Let's jump right into it. Chapter 3. I get a few early birthday presents. The next few weeks passed in a blur for Percy and Annabeth. Shortly after meeting Xanthe for the first time, they traveled back to New York, via train so Percy didn't end up blasted, to visit Sally and Paul before heading back to camp. They would be meeting up with Frederick toward the end of the summer before returning to school. Percy told his mom all about their adventures in the libraries of the gods, and even pulled out a copy of the Atlantean book for his mom. "I thought you may be able to read some of the more PG ones to Estelle," Percy asked quietly. Sally and Paul had been thrilled to read the book and determine what stories were more child-appropriate, or what could be altered to be more appropriate for a child. Percy found himself pleased his little sister would grow up knowing about Percy's side of the family, though after Rhode had discovered the little girl, he had a feeling Atlantis would go to war for Percy's little sister. He also had an odd sense that the sea itself would not harm his Estelle, and suspected the royal family had something to do with it. After spending a few days with his family, Percy and Annabeth had Argus pick them up and return them to camp. Argus had already made multiple stops, and so Percy was delighted to see several campers already in the van bound for camp, including the Stoll brothers, Katie Gardner, and Maria, a daughter of Hermes. All of them had been off for their senior years in high school, except for Connor, who had just finished up his junior year. They talked about how the year had gone and told them about the books they had gotten a hold of their siblings of old. They all were eager to read the stories. Sometimes, as a demigod, you don't feel much attachment to your Greek side. It was hard to be raised into a mortal world and thrown into these terrifying and deadly situations with zero idea of where you actually fit into these stories and myths and legends. The stories showed how many of these demigods had survived these perils and lived lives of their own. The most gruesome stories stuck with them, however, there were still more happy endings in these books than they had ever heard mythology taught to them before. It had given them all hope for a better future. After a short drive full of conversations and planning for the upcoming summer, Percy had somehow found himself promising to help the Hermes cabin with a few pranks the Stoll brothers had decided to pull, and they arrived back at camp. As he stepped across the border, Percy found himself taking in a deep sigh of relief as the power of Camp Half-Blood fell over him. He looked around and noticed numbers had increased in each cabin exponentially, and newer demigods were following Chiron around as he gave them a tour. Spotting him and the others, Chiron gestured to the demigods to follow him over, and Percy couldn't help but smile reassuringly at the younger demigods. There were 3 younger kids, only one only 9 years old, the others looking closer to 13. "Here we are, young ones. Meet Percy Jackson and Annabeth Chase, heads of the Poseidon and Athena cabins respectively," Chiron introduced. The younger girl was blonde with a familiar pair of sharp gray eyes peering out from under a mess of hair. She was dressed in a fresh camp t-shirt and running shorts, though the girl looked exhausted. The other two were boys, one with a mop of blonde hair and mischievous blue eyes that peered around at the gathered campers excitedly. The final boy was probably closest to 13, and yawned at the group indifferently, rubbing his eyes. He had dark brown hair and sleepy brown eyes that peered around at him, looking as though it was taking him a lot of effort to keep his eyes open. While Percy had already guessed who 2 of the campers belonged to, the blonde-haired boy remained a mystery to him. "Hey," Percy said with an awkward wave. The kids stared at him. Even the brown-haired boy seemed to wake up a bit. The blonde boy's eyes widened. "You were the one in the video they showed us. Can you really make a hurricane?" he asked excitedly, practically bouncing on his feet. "I can, but I don't do it very often." Percy laughed awkwardly, feeling odd that so many campers knew of him before he even met them. He scratched the back of his head and glanced at Chiron, who smiled at him knowingly. Damn that centaur for his foresight. The kids dissolved into questions to both of them and the other campers, somehow introducing themselves as they went. The blonde-haired girl was named Celestate, while the blonde boy was Jamie, and the brown-haired boy was named Noah. "All right, children, please follow the Stoll brothers to cabin 11, where you can all get settled in the unclaimed section for now. Soon, hopefully, your godly parents will claim you, and we will get you settled in with any half-siblings you may have," Chiron said, beginning to herd the children and the Stolls toward the Hermes cabin. As they were walking away, Annabeth suddenly gasped as a silver owl appeared, clutching a paper scroll with an olive branch at each foot, directly over Celestate's head. Percy grinned with satisfaction. It had been obvious, but he was glad Athena had claimed her so quickly. Annabeth had guessed as well, and they had shared a point look at Celeste as Celestate had begun her interrogations, but she too was surprised Athena had stepped in so quickly. Often the guards waited until the campfire captured the flag to claim their children in front of the camp. "Hail, Celestate Hillcrest, daughter of Lady Athena, goddess of wisdom and battle strategy," Chiron said, a pleased tone in his voice. Everyone bowed or nodded their heads respectfully towards the girl, the other 2 children hastening to follow the older camper's example after looking around. "Well, Celeste, let's take you over to our cabin," Annabeth said happily, warmth in her tone. Percy smiled and nodded to the girl as she took Annabeth's hand, rapid-fire questions pouring out of the girl's mouth about her newly discovered heritage. Annabeth grinned in amusement, answering each question quickly and efficiently as the girl carried her small pack of belongings toward cabin 6. Annabeth called a brief goodbye to Percy, promising to meet up with him after she got her new sister settled and caught up with the other siblings in her cabin. Chiron and the other children, along with the Stolls, moved towards the Hermes cabin, fielding questions from the blond boy as they went about claimings. The brown-haired boy trailed along sleepily, mumbling to himself about needing a nap. Grabbing his own stuff and waving goodbye to Katie, who moved towards her own cabin, Percy walked towards cabin 3, greeting his friends and cousins happily as he went. Everyone's mood seemed significantly better, and camp looked quite lovely today in the afternoon sun. The weather was fair, and the strawberries in the fields swayed happily as the satyrs and children of Demeter sang and walked among the rows. A small patch of grapes now grew closer to the Dionysus cabin, as Zeus had rewarded the wine god after the giant war by removing his restrictions and allowing a small portion of grapes to be grown for Dionysus to create and sell the wine along with strawberries. It allowed for increased funding to camp, as the wine was of the highest quality and sought after by auction houses. Pollux handled the sales now, as he was now 22, and even he was looking into opening his own winery sometime soon. Dionysus had also claimed 2 more of his children, a daughter and son named Penelope and Christopher, respectively. Pollux had taken them under his wing immediately, and was fiercely protective of them after losing Castor. Despite having his restrictions regarding his powers lifted, Dionysus had been instructed to remain at camp for the remainder of his sentence. While the god was not pleased about this, he was somewhat happier than he was before. He was often spotted tending the grapes with his children, teaching them calmly how to use and manipulate their power safely. Percy was appreciative of that, as Penelope had inherited much of her father's power over the mind. One night she was picked on by a few older campers, including a few Ares kids, and had snapped at one of their comments, sending the boy into a screaming mess of madness. Dionysus had been able to easily repair the boy's mind. However, he had also taken more time to explore these powers with his daughter, so she did not hurt anyone else accidentally. More new cabins glistened in Apollo's light, some still under construction. Every time a new minor god claimed a camper, a cabin was commissioned for them. Percy often found new groups of demigod children arriving shortly after cabins were finished, allowing them to move directly into the newly built safe haven. Percy knew the gods were content for the moment. The minor gods received more respect and kindness, and for now Olympus recovered in peace. It still felt wrong to him, in a way. It still felt like something was coming. Percy shrugged off his feeling, moving towards the cabin with his stuff. To his surprise, he did not enter a dust-filled cabin. Instead, it was clean and tidy. His fountain bubbled in the corner, shining as if it had recently been cleaned and polished. His head cocked to the side as he listened further, a new water source trickling from behind the cabin. After tossing his bag on the bed, he cautiously crept outside toward the back of his cabin. His cabin backed up directly to the lake, and he often spent hours out there watching the water. The sound of the ocean in the distance would lull him to sleep. He stepped outside and blinked at shock at what was revealed to him. The wooden walkway had been replaced with sea stones from the depths, and a thin path of stone surrounded a large pool of salt water that went deeper than he originally expected it to. Staring down into the water with shock, he realized that it was a coral pool, filled with fresh sea water and structures of incredible coral that he knew came from the Great Barrier Reef. Schools of colorful fish swam among the rocks, swimming excitedly when he noticed them. "Hello, little lord," they called to him before swimming away further into the rocks happily. Percy muttered a brief hello as a black-tipped shark swam to the surface, wiggling happily as Percy scratched gently behind the dorsal fin. Still stunned, he turned his face upward, noticing a small waterfall at the other end of the pool. He also made of sea stone and decorated with bits of ocean plant life. "Whoa," Percy muttered, looking over the entire structure with awe. Who in the world had put this here? He found himself wondering. Suddenly a mist of sea spray fell into place next to him, and a dark-haired figure in a sea-green chiton appeared next to him, smiling warmly. "Hi, Rhode," Percy said, still blinking. Rhode smiled at him, gesturing toward the pool. "An early birthday present," she stated matter-of-factly. "Pulled from a dying section of the Great Barrier Reef. Now it is forever preserved. The fish and animals will never go hungry here, and the water will remain clean without effort. A blessing from Father when I told him what I planned," she explained, leaning down to place her hand in the water. The fish swarmed. "Lady of Rhodes!" they sang to her cheerfully. Thanks," Percy laughed. He was grateful. It was a beautiful piece, and his father knows how often he needed salt water to correct minor injuries he acquired. Rhode smiled and nodded at him happily, sitting down with her legs in the water. Percy joined her after pulling off his shoes. He felt a million times better after entering the water. Your last few birthdays have been somewhat eventful, and we haven't properly celebrated with you since things have calmed down due to the reconstruction efforts and all. Rhode started, and Percy almost winced. With a few great prophecies, he was about done with the whole event entirely. And I really wanted to make sure you could enjoy your gift through the summer. I believe a few of our sisters are much the same, and you should be expecting several gifts this summer. Rhode laughed. Percy grimaced. You guys know you didn't have to get me anything, right? I'm pretty happy with how things have been going lately, as long as no new prophecies or quests come my way, Percy said pointedly, looking over at his godly sister. It was Rhode's turn to wince, as she turned her gaze back towards the pool. If anyone would dare disturb you, I have a feeling Father would send Atlantis to war, she said in a lighter tone, a tint of amusement coloring her voice. Percy sighed, knowing that it was probably true. Well, thank you, though. It is really cool. I'll admit I was worried about maintaining it, Percy said, also turning his eyes back into the pool. Fish swam happily around his feet, remaining quiet as he spoke with his sister. It is also safe for your friends to swim in it if you wish. The water will not harm them, and they will be able to breathe. Rhode informed him happily, smiling warmly at the white-tipped shark who made its way into the surface like a small puppy, practically waggling its tail. Hopefully we should have plenty of time to explore it this summer, Percy said, also smiling at the small shark swimming around happily. Rhode nodded, looking over the water. So, when should I expect the others? Percy laughed somewhat nervously, side-eyeing his older sister. Rhode laughed. Soon, I would imagine. They're quite thrilled. It has been a long time since we'd had a younger sibling such as you to spoil, she told him. Percy frowned at that. He knew he had other siblings born since the pact, though maybe not demigod ones. What about the young nymphs or Cyclops Dad has? Percy asked, somewhat cold in his tone. He found he cared for Tyson and his other Cyclops brothers a great deal, and it insulted him when others looked down on them. He had yet to meet any of his nymph half-siblings, but he had a feeling that was intentional. Rhode shook her head. We do care for them, but culture is different there. Cyclops claim all of Father's offsprings for the Forge. It's an ongoing agreement he has with them. He knows his sons are cared for there, and his nymph daughters are usually claimed by the sea and my mother's sisters. They are well cared for there, and honestly much happier than if they were to be at court. The only children he can claim for himself, for the royal family, are those born between him and Mother, and any of his demigod children. We still feel protective of them, yes, especially Father. However, they are not his alone to claim from the old powers, Rhode explained, looking at him to assess his understanding. Percy nodded in slight understanding. And since no new gods have been born recently, and I'm his first demigod in a while, you all have decided I need more gifts than I know what to do with, he asked incredulously. Rhode laughed. The olden days were easier with less restriction. Xanthe was able to visit court a few times before her ascension, and meet all of us a lot younger than you did. You are all of the sea, and for that we care for you. The sea is possessive of its own, Rhode answered, looking at him warmly. Percy blushed, muttering something about not needing attention, and Rhode chuckled. Well, I must be going. I still hope to see you all at the party. Chiron is making the announcement tonight, and the council has even approved it. Father was originally not pleased. Xanthe and Kim frequently thrown what is known in the immortal realm as a rager, Rhode said, slight confusion in the last part of her tone. Percy snorted out a laugh. He could see it with Kim especially. However, Xanthe and Kim have promised to be on their best behavior. Xan especially would not allow little ones in danger. She used to be quite protective of her demigods at the training grounds, Rhode finished, looking fondly out towards the water. An answering breeze that smelled like lemons and seawater filled the air, and Percy knew Xanthe's attention had been summoned. It quickly faded, though. Percy tried not to feel disappointed. He knew Xanthe was busy, but he hadn't seen her since that final day of classes a few weeks prior, and he was interested in speaking with her again. Thank you again for the pool. It really is incredible, Percy said to his sister, smiling at her softly once more. He protested as she grinned and rustled his hair before she waved her goodbyes and disappeared into a spray of salt water in the pool, the scent of olive oil and sea spray lingering for a few moments afterwards. Percy! Voice called from outside the cabin. Are you there? Someone called, a familiar voice. Percy grinned, turning back to call out. Come on in, I'm out back. The sound of footsteps walking through the cabin quickly followed, and Percy was suddenly stuck with an armful of Piper. She pulled back from the hug, grinning happily at him. How have you been? How are classes? Are you all ready for this summer? She asked excitedly, kaleidoscope eyes dancing in the late afternoon sun. She then noticed the large saltwater pool and gasped as she peered down into it. Percy laughed and quickly explained, when suddenly another voice called out from the side of the cabin, footsteps quickly making their way around. Leo flew around the corner, smiling ear to ear. He was covered in soot and had metal scraps sticking out of his pockets. Percy and him grinned at each other, and greetings were met all around. After thinking Leo had died, the remaining 7 had all grieved together. When suddenly one night Festus had flown back into camp, carrying none other than Leo and Calypso, there had been a lot of crying, hugging, and punching from the group, but overall they were just thrilled the physician's cure had worked and brought Leo home to them. Things between Percy and Calypso had been awkward at first, as Percy had not quite forgiven her for the curse she had placed on Annabeth, which had manifested itself in Tartarus. After a few weeks of not really speaking, Calypso had approached him and apologized. She regretted the curse as soon as Leo had explained everything from the end of the Titan War onwards, and had figured out when the curse had come out active. After working through their issues, Percy and Calypso were on all right terms, though they were by no means close. Annabeth, too, had a hard time looking the Titaness in the eyes, though, thankfully, Calypso had also offered her a heartfelt apology. They had also collectively, as a camp, agreed to make her swear on the sticks that she would never raise a hand against the demigods with intent to harm them, and she had done so without issue. Currently, however, she was off visiting a few of her long-lost sisters she hadn't seen since her banishment, leaving Leo at camp for the summer to meet up with everyone. After explaining everything once more to Leo and Jason, who had just joined them from Camp Jupiter earlier in the day, they all headed off as the conch shell sounded and signaled dinner. The rule about eating at your godly parents' table had been dissolved after the giant war, and demigods now scattered about the tables next to their friends and partners from other cabins. Annabeth had rejoined them, greeting Percy cheerfully as he asked how Celeste was fitting in. Together, the group of them sat down together as their plates filled with fresh brisket, green beans, cornbread, and mashed potatoes. Percy looked around, a feeling of contentedness in his stomach as he took in the campers around him. It was, for the first time since he was very young, peaceful here. Of course, for nearly 100 people, it was not silent or calm. However, everyone's expressions were peaceful and content here with each other. No impending war over their heads, no impending doom or prophecies. Rachel had also returned to camp that day, and moved quickly over to join them. They all spoke and laughed happily, discussing their stories from the year they had spent apart. Admittedly, they did have more contact with each other now long distance, as they had been gifted cell phones from the Hephaestus and Athena cabins after the war, along with the rest of the head counselors for potential emergencies. Thankfully, no serious issues required them to be used. However, they were far more monster-resistant thanks to the tinkering done by the 2 cabins, and they were less able to be tracked after using them. They primarily tried to use them only within the safety of camp, however, where it seemed to not bring any attention to them. Percy stood and walked over the bronze hearth, blazing happily with offerings that had been sent already to the gods. Percy dumped a slice of brisket into the fire, along with a clump of grapes he had picked up earlier. He internally designated the blessing to his father and siblings, and then paused for a moment. He then slid a small portion of cake into the fire, muttering a prayer to Xanthe for safety. He had a feeling her fight at the Coral Palace was bigger than he originally expected. Lemons and sea salt, a unique blend Percy had discovered after beginning his small offerings to Xanthe, filled the air around him, spiraling upwards across the crowd of demigods, nymphs, and satyrs. A few with strong noses glanced upward at the smell, and Percy felt pleased his sister had extended her thanks across the camp. Percy made his way back to their table, returning to his spot next to Annabeth, who smiled at him. He couldn't help but plant a small kiss on her lips, before turning back to the others and resuming conversations about their summer plans. Well, we cannot forget the most important event, the Atlantan party that is apparently being thrown. Annabeth laughed, looking at Percy with a smile. Percy shook his head, chuckling. I'm fairly sure your sister would curse me with sea storms if I don't attend at this point, Jason muttered warily, glancing around as though Kymopoleia would appear instantly to blast him on sight. Percy nodded at him knowingly. 100%, Percy laughed. Her priest not showing up to her party? She'd be in a bad mood for decades, he said. Jason groaned and muttered something into his cornbread. Leo and Piper looked at the 3 demigods who had been in New Rome for the school year. Party? Leo asked incredulously, looking upset that no one had discussed it with them. What do you mean Percy's sister's throwing a party? At this point, I'm 85% sure Atlantis itself is sponsoring the party, Percy groaned, turning to explain the meeting with Xanthe and his other sisters, along with a few events that followed. Leo and Piper looked thrilled and began swiftly chattering about what they expected to go down at the party. Shortly after, they were interrupted by Chiron standing from the head table, clinking his fork against his glass. After a few moments of shushing, everyone fell silent and turned their attention to the immortal trainer of heroes. Welcome back to our first night of summer session, Chiron started. The tables all cheered, clapping and hooting their excitement. Chiron calmly waited for them to settle before continuing. A few brief announcements, and You You've all been reminded of camp rules, and I do hope we follow them this summer. To our newest demigods, I hope you'll find safety and happiness here, the centaur said, looking around at a few new faces. A few mentions for this summer. We will be performing chariot races once a month. The first one to take place will be held in 3 weeks. Cheers went up, and people celebrated. Chiron clinked his glass and fork together, and slowly everyone pittered into silence again. One more announcement from the royal family of Atlantis, as well as Olympus. Hushed whispers as people glanced over at Percy, who smiled at them all knowingly. From Princesses Rhode, Kymopoleia, and Xanthe, a formal invitation has been sent out to both the Roman and Greek camps. All demigods aged 16 and up have been invited to a celebration on the 13th of June, 1 week before the summer solstice. A few Roman demigods will be arriving later this week, and Lady Rhode herself will be hosting on the Isle of Rhodes. Chiron announced, and the demigods roared to life, talking and chattering with each other excitedly. A royal party was no small event, and some of the demigods had never experienced before. Alas, children! Chiron called, momentarily quieting the crowd. Remember, you are being hosted by the gods. Lord Poseidon himself has given permission for all to attend. But please remember to be respectful of their time and work to put this on. Any questions about this celebration may be passed through me, and I will work to get an answer for you. Chiron finished, noting many of the campers had stopped paying attention. He stopped his left hind foot against the floor, and quickly everyone fell silent for a final time. All of that being said, welcome to Camp Demigods, and let us make this a wonderful summer. Chiron called. Finally, cheers erupted once more as people moved away from the dining pavilion and towards the campfire. Percy, too, stood with his friends. Hazel and Frank would be joining them later in the week with the Roman legions. Percy was glad the Roman guest house was finished recently to allow Roman demigods safety at Camp Half-Blood if needed. As he settled into the campfire with his friends around him, Annabeth sat happily by his side. The campfire soared 12 feet tall into the air as the Apollo cabin led them in song. It was a newer song Percy hadn't heard before, discussing the feats of one of Apollo's daughters, a legendary healer in the Greek times. It must have been from the books that had been distributed across camp. The song sung her history of tending to the wounded on the battlefield, and had coined them the term field medic in her time. She tended to thousands of injured demigods and mortals alike with her abilities before she was granted eternal rest in the Isle of the Blessed for her good deeds toward all the godly children she encountered. It was a lovely song, and the campfire grew stronger as other cabins called out stories to be told of their sisters and brothers of old. Percy smiled happily, leaning his head to rest on top of his girlfriend's. This is what they had wanted all along, a piece of their history to learn about and teach about, to remind younger campers battles and glory was not all to be had with their abilities. He felt happy and content. Shortly after s'mores, everyone trickled away back towards their cabins. Annabeth leading, and exhausted Celeste stayed back towards their cabin with a quick kiss goodnight to Percy. They often stayed together in the Poseidon cabin, but Annabeth had several new siblings to get to know, so for the time being she stayed there with them. Percy bid everyone good night, falling into bed in blissful unconsciousness. Percy thankfully did not dream that night, as he often did. And in fact, did not dream the next few nights either. Percy had spent the past few days training a few sword-fighting classes, playing the first game of Capture the Flag and winning, as per usual, as well as getting to know several of the new campers. At the current moment, Percy was alone in the training arena. His first class of the morning had finished up, and Percy was taking a few minutes to practice on his own. He had just finished a battle with the automatons the Hephaestus cabin had created over the winter for training practice when he smelled a familiar scent of sea salt and lemons coming from up near the seats. Sheathing Riptide, as at camp he did not necessarily need to hide it in pen form while he was training, he turned and squinted across the arena where his older sister had appeared. Percy was honestly quite surprised to see her, and he had yet to hear anything from her besides the breeze he felt when he offered to her. Xanthe smiled at him from the other side of the arena. She was dressed like a mortal today, as she had been the last time, though this time she was in a pair of black leggings, sage green tennis shoes, and a grey tank top. Her long blonde hair was pulled into a high ponytail, and a trident was sheathed across her back in a leather holder that was wrapped around her shoulders and secured around her diaphragm. She pushed herself away from the wall she stood against, walking towards him and clapping slowly. Well done. You have excellent battle skills. I see your sword fighting lessons with Triton, Artemis. You could easily defeat over half of the Atlantean Legion. Xanthe said, a pleased tone in her voice. Percy grinned and muttered his thanks, grabbing his bottle of water and dumping it over his head. He instantly felt significantly better, and nodded to his sister as she approached. It was then he could inspect the trident more closely, and noted with slightly widened eyes the power pulsating from it. This was most certainly a godly weapon. Whoa, Percy said, peering at the celestial bronze creation. It was maybe 5 feet and a few inches long, shorter than his father's was, and etched with details of large waves crashing inshore. At the hilt, where the prongs emerged, sharpened to an easily deadly point, a sea-green stone sat inlaid, surrounded by several softly glowing pearls. Xanthe, noticing his interest, pulled it from its sheath in one fluid motion, handing the trident over to him. Percy's eyes widened in surprise, and he took it from her, feeling a thrum of power run through it. Suddenly he smelt what could only be described as a violent sea, could hear the sounds of crashing waves, and taste the sensation of blood in his mouth. It unnerved him, causing him to shift on his feet, staring at the weapon in surprise. Xanthe laughed at him. Sorry, she said, taking the weapon back from his hands into her own. I forgot how jarring she can be to most people. She explained, looking at the weapon and running her fingers over familiar grooves. It's amazing, Percy found himself saying. Long ago he had wondered if he would be any good battling with the weapon. His siblings often used it, as it was the symbol of their father, and he knew Xanthe had carried this weapon into battle years ago. Catastrophical Gima, Xanthe said softly, pulling her eyes upward from the weapon before returning it to its sheath along her back. Or destructive wave. She served me quite well over the years, the goddess said fondly. Percy supposed the goddess of tsunamis would name her weapon after the power of the wave she controlled. He knew the devastation tsunamis could wreak across the world, and that many mortals had fallen at their hands. He, at first, had been upset by the amount of mortals lost to the sea, asking his father if it was the temper of the sea that pulled them in. Poseidon admitted the sea responded to his and the royal family's emotions, but also reminded Percy the sea still had a function to perform. All aspects, including deadly ones, had to be respected and performed, as was his duty as king and the duty of his godly children. Is that the one you had as a demigod? Percy asked curiously. It is. Father gifted it to me when I turned 10 and was taken to the training grounds. My siblings taught me how to wield it. I taught my younger siblings in turn. It's rather sad to me that no one bothered to hand you one when you were younger. You would have done quite well. Xanthe replied, looking meaningfully over the racks of weapons that held no tridents. Percy shrugged. I'm pretty fond of riptide. Besides, I've never trained with a trident. How do you know I'd be good at it? He replied, raising an eyebrow. Xanthe laughed, meeting his expression. It's father's weapon of power. All his children have some ability to handle one, she responded. Percy blinked. Huh. I probably would have liked to know that earlier, he muttered, his gaze, too, landing on the weapons rack. It could have come in handy if he had known how to use one. He did know tridents allowed for a longer reach than swords did, and worked well against an enemy you need to maintain distance from when engaged in combat. Well, Father actually planned on giving you one for your birthday this year. Xanthe started, reaching into her pocket. Percy looked over at her in surprise as a small charm emerged from her pocket and into her open palm. It was a bronze trident charm that, within a blink of an eye, expanded to a full-sized trident, radiating with power of its own. Percy looked at it in shock. Xanthe held it out to him intentionally, placing it into his surprised hands. However, I beat him to it this time. He was quite grumpy that I outpaced him for his plans. So expect something outlandish from him for your birthday to make up for it. His godly sister said with a laugh, while Percy inspected the weapon in his hands. Felt like it belonged there, the same way Riptide did while in his grasp. It was made of celestial bronze for the prongs. A single pearl rested in the middle. Halfway down the shaft, the bronze blended into polished sea stone that was smoothed and blended seamlessly into the bronze. As he turned it upright into his hands, it flashed and resized itself until it was a few inches taller than Xanthe's. Why did it do that? Percy asked, looking over the inscription at the hilt where the prongs emerged, each sharpened to a beautiful point. It read, Ipsili Palidia, on the opposite side of the pearl, which Percy's mind translated to high tide. Xanthe nodded at the weapon, her gaze sizing it up appraisingly. It'll grow to fit you. I have a feeling you still have a few inches left in you. Our brothers always grew in their early 20s, though mortals are significantly taller now than they used to be, she explained. Huh, I forgot about that. Were demigods taller than regular mortals? Percy asked, still inspecting the trident in his hands with awe. Xanthe shrugged, looking like she was thinking about something. I think typically, though not always by an outrageous amount, Xanthe elaborated. I was considered a taller woman in my time, though most male demigods beat me in the height department. I was fairly taller than most mortal men, though, by at least an inch or two. Considering his sister was approximately 5'8" in what she considered her true form, or demigod self-form, based on the fact that Percy was 6'2" at this point, he could see how she would have towered over them to an extent. The lower half of the staff is sea stones from the deepest points of the ocean. It'll allow you to summon the weapon back to you if you lose your grip. It also, with practice, will allow you to control it without using your hands. I'm giving it to you early so you have time to practice with it before summer ends. Xanthe finished, smiling at him. You really didn't have to do this, Percy started, Xanthe shooting him a stern look, so he sighed in response. But thank you, really. It is beautiful, he said, looking over the weapon once more. Xanthe's pleased expression returned as she further explained how the weapon could be shrunk at a thought and returned to his beaded necklace as a charm, so it could always be with him. Percy couldn't bring himself to do it yet, instead turning the thrumming weapon over in his hands. It seemed happy to him, thrilling slightly at the feeling of being in his fingertips. I'll be popping in to give you a few lessons with it, of course, Xanthe said abruptly, causing his eyes to snap back to her in surprise. And a few warriors trained in Trident combat will stop by to help you from time to time, she continued, nodding at the weapon. Wow, thank you? Percy stuttered out in shock. Xanthe grinned at him wickedly, suddenly pulling her own trident from its sheath and lunging at him with it. Percy yelped in response, pulling up high tide to block the incoming prongs from glancing him in the shoulder. So we're starting now? Percy called after shoving the prongs backwards towards his sister and moving away from her by a few feet, instinctively pulling the weapon in front of him. Oh, absolutely! Xanthe laughed, eyes breaking over him. She raised both hands peacefully, sheathing her trident once more and stepping toward him, correcting his grip slightly and moving his feet to a wider stance. Keep your feet wider for balance. If you ever feel like you're starting to tip over, redirect them. Trident can be used to regain slipped footing in a fight, but it must be done quickly before your enemy can catch up to your recovery. She explained, retreating and pulling her trident from her back once more. Now come on, she said cheerfully, eyes darkening slightly with the type of glee he had yet to see in her. Charge me. Percy obliged with a laugh, moving quickly towards his sister with good speed, aiming the trident towards her chest. Xanthe smacked the prongs quickly away from her, moving Percy with it from the force, spinning behind him to whack him in the ribs with the shaft of her weapon. Percy spun too, recovering with a new determination, and allowing Xanthe to charge him this time. They sparred for nearly an hour, Percy sweating, bruised, and exhausted toward the end. Xanthe smiled, plopping down next to him, offering a cup of water he took and dumped over himself, feeling his aches disappear. You fight well, Xanthe exclaimed happily, looking back towards their weapons they had left in the weapons rack. You took to the weapon well, too. You'll master it by the end of the year, I'm sure, she said. Yeah, fights well. Percy scoffed good-naturedly, looking at his sister pointedly. You just bashed my brains out around that ring, he said. Xanthe chuckled at him. I've been fighting in wars for thousands of years, little brother. With that weapon at my side, she said proudly, summoning a destructive wave to her hands. She looked at it meaningfully, still tracing the patterns in the bronze metal. You do fight well. Anyone else would be struggling to fend you off. Percy was suddenly reminded how old his siblings were. It was easy to view Xanthe as a young woman and his other siblings as middle-aged, but he sometimes forgot how ancient they were, how many empires they'd watched rise and fall, and how many enemies they had defeated before he was ever conceived. Because of that, he felt pleased with the praise, warmth filling his stomach. I haven't seen you in a while. Have the attacks gotten worse around the palace? Percy asked suddenly, glancing over at Xanthe. His sister sighed darkly, clutching the trident in her hands slightly tighter, shaking her head. Unfortunately, yes. We're starting to wonder if older sea gods are disturbed in the recent wars and are now itching for battle. We woke up a bit late, though, so they missed the main party, Xanthe said, eyeing the direction the ocean was in. Is it bad? Percy asked quickly, a serious tone emerging in his voice. Xanthe shrugged. None could stand to father now that the Titan Lord and Earth Mother have been dealt with, but war could be costly to the people, so we hope nothing of the sort will occur. Atlantis is still coming out of recovery and rebuilding from the years of fighting, she said, looking at him briefly. But are you in danger? Percy asked. Xanthe smiled reassuringly at him. Not at the moment. I stay near the palace most days to assist in larger skirmishes. The guards and legions mostly take care of things. I'm there in case something bigger comes along. Father visits a few times a month to check in. Helps take care of anything going on while he's around. He can't stay long, though. He has much to take care of in Atlantis. Xanthe soothed, though Percy did not feel very reassured. Why do I feel like that's not the entire truth? He asked, staring at her seriously. Xanthe's smile faded, and she looked at him with equal seriousness. "It may not be the full truth, but it is the truth as I know it," the goddess replied, patting Percy on the shoulder. "For now, I'm in no danger. Few would dare challenge me near the palace. If any stronger beings begin to stir, I'll be the first to summon Father or Triton to challenge it. I'm a commander of the army, but not a general. If I feel out of my depth, I will call for help, little brother. I'm old, but not a fool," she reminded him, eyes full of knowledge he couldn't read. Percy nodded slightly. "Okay, as long as you're sure it's nothing serious." Xanthe nodded at him once more, and Percy did feel better. His sister, it seemed, did know her limits well, and Xanthe nodded at him once more, and Percy did feel better. His sister, it seemed, did know her limits. Stupid, okay. But she was also once a demigod, and Percy knew they had a habit of getting themselves in trouble before even realizing it. "Could I maybe check in with you every once in a while?" Percy asked suddenly, and Xanthe looked at him with a surprised expression. "You know, like letters or iris messages or something like that," he finished quickly. Sure?" Xanthe said quickly, blinking at him. Warmth filled her tone. "I'd like that. I may write back some if you would be okay with it," she asked. Percy nodded quickly. It would be nice to have some contact with her, even though she was incredibly busy. "As for the party, you're still able to make it, right?" Xanthe grinned at Percy's question, laughing. "Of course! It was basically my idea. Rhode would kill me if I skipped it," Xanthe said, chuckling. "Besides, it's been a few months since I've attended a good party, and I managed to convince the Muses to come and perform for us that day, so I would be murdered by them if I dared to skip." She laughed. "The Muses?" Percy squawked in surprise, looking over at her. "How many beings did you invite to this party?" he asked in shock. Xanthe erupted into laughter. "Honestly, this party idea has snowballed," she giggled finally, looking over at him with mirth in her eyes. "I think Apollo and Hermes are showing up, along with dozens of other demigods, godly parties, nymphs, and various other immortals." She admitted somewhat sheepishly at Percy's shocked expression. "Oh my gods, what have you dragged me into?" he groaned, putting his head in his hands. Xanthe laughed again before suddenly falling silent, turning her face toward the ocean. "I hear ya," she said quietly, a serious tone in her voice. Percy's amusement left, and he watched as Xanthe stood, taking her offered hand as she pulled him to his feet. "Coming now," she replied to someone, still gazing outwards. She returned her gaze to Percy, smiling ruefully at him. "It appears you've been summoned," Percy chuckled without humor, rubbing the back of his head. "It appears I have," Xanthe replied with a wry smile. "I've got to get going. Minor skirmish with a sea serpent a short ways from the Coral Palace. They'll need my help to finish it off. It's rather large, though thankfully does not appear venomous," she said, sighing. "Thanks again for my present. I'll write to you soon, but I guess I'll be seeing you sometime next week," Percy replied with a dry laugh. "Anytime, little brother, and thanks for the offerings. They've been nice," Xanthe said, softening her tone towards the end of her sentence and averting her gaze. He gathered she felt somewhat embarrassed about them, but he vowed to keep giving her and his other siblings offerings when he remembered. He waved goodbye as she disappeared into mist, the sound of roaring wave behind it. Percy heard chattering behind him as the third-level swordsman class began trickling in behind him. "Wow, Prissy, since when did you own that sweet thing?" a voice called. Clarice had returned to camp the day before and volunteered with Percy to help teach weapons classes, taking control of the spirit classes as Percy was not well versed in that weapon during combat. The daughter of the war god walked closer to the rack of weapons, noticing how he tied right off the bat, and she glanced over it appreciatively before turning back to him. The younger demigods, largely 14 to 15-year-olds, approached the rack too, grabbing their own weapons, while the children of Ares and Hephaestus together inspected High Tide as well, chattering excitedly about and staring at Percy. About an hour ago, gift from my godly sister," Percy said, amusement in his tone. He walked over and lifted out from the ring of young half-bloods, gently placing it into Jack's, a younger son of Hephaestus' hands. The boy looked at it reverently, his sister Kim, writing down frantic notes about the design, with a quick warning not to throw or stab the weapon at others. He also allowed them to look it over with interest. Clarice whistled when it was handed to her, looking up and down the prongs with interest. This is nicely crafted weapon, Prissy. You got lucky." Percy laughed and took the weapon from her, spinning it over in his hands until it shrunk into a small charm that magically attached itself to the beaded necklace around his neck. This inspired a new wave of clamoring from the gathered kids, before quickly Percy and Clarice began guiding them through their warm-ups for the class. Of course, Clarice and him had to go toe-to-toe after the class ended, the daughter of war eager to see how the trident would fare in combat. They had spun around the arena in a blaze, knocking each other to and fro with glee. While Clarice and him were by no means BFFs, they had gotten closer since the war, and Clarice had found a purpose in training with her younger siblings to the best of her ability. She had lost nearly half of her cabin in the past 2 wars, and did not like seeing her siblings' blood spilled, and she and Percy together worked to ensure the next generation of demigods was ready for whatever the fates threw their way. Percy arrived at dinner that night, exhausted, quickly going over the day's events with his friends and Annabeth, eating and talking with everyone before returning to his cabin and falling swiftly asleep. Percy awoke to the sound of music coming from where his new saltwater pool was, blasting techno with heavy bass that thrummed from outside. It wasn't loud enough to wake him, but it did bring his attention when he woke. He padded outside in his PJs, glancing around and squinting in the early morning sun. It was barely 8 o'clock, he noticed, before spotting the source of the sound in front of him. Kymopoleia was floating in the water in front of him, dressed in a black bikini and dark sunglasses. She floated on a sea serpent raft on the water, a glass of wine clutched in her hand. Music was blasting from the small boom box that sat on the edge of the pool, and next to it was a small, poorly wrapped present in blue wrapping paper. Percy had a sneaking suspicion of what was coming. "It's a bit early in the morning for drinking, I believe," Percy snarked, hands on his hips at his older sister. Kim pulled down her sunglasses, grinning up at him with rows of sharp teeth. "As the mortals say, it is 5 o'clock somewhere," she replied. Percy snorted, sitting at the edge of the pool and muttering soft greetings to the fish. Kim sat up on the raft, pulling something out of thin air and tossing it to him. It was a figurine of a small boat that looked as though it was an old pirate ship. Percy turned it over in his hands, inspecting it. "Happy early birthday," Kim said cheerfully, grinning in expectation. Percy blinked at the object, feeling like there was more to this. Thanks, Kim," he chuckled, holding up the wooden vessel. "It's very cool." Kim rolled her eyes and gestured to it. "It's enchanted, and when it tosses in the sea, it'll become full size," she grumbled. "Oh, wow. Thank you," he said in shock, looking closer at the detail on the ship. Cyclone was scrawled on the side. "I sank that ship a few 100 years back in one of my storms. I've been saving it and repairing it ever since. I have lots of ships, however, you don't, and I thought you may like one," Kim stated, gesturing toward the small figure. "But there's another present for you over there from Triton," she said, sighing and pointing at the present. Percy snorted at the wrapping paper. It looked as though someone had tried wrapping it underwater before giving up, tying a bow made out of kelp around it and sending it onwards. "Well, A for effort on the wrap job," he laughed, pushing himself into the pool and closer towards the package and boom box. "Yes, I do believe he consulted Mother for help, but neither of them are well versed in mortal aspects such as gift wrapping," Kim said, voice dripping with amusement. Percy gently untangled the string and pulled apart the wrapping paper, pulling out a conch shell reminiscent of the one Percy knew was Triton's symbol of power. A gold trident was carved on the side. "It's beautiful," Percy said quietly, muttering his thanks to both Triton and Amphitrite, and he felt the sea-scented wind tinged with the scent of pine ruffle his hair. "It brings you directly to Atlantis if you blow through it," Kim explained, gesturing towards it. "They thought it would be best to give you a quicker way to come and visit without needing to swim for a good distance. It is also a standing invitation for you, and any who wish to accompany you. It grants them safety in the palace, and allows those you bring to breathe while on Atlantean grounds. If you want them to breathe outside of the palace, I'd ask Father for his blessing. Otherwise, you'd have to maintain the enchantment," Kim said quickly, settling back into her floaty. "Whoa," Percy muttered, looking at it in shock. "Considering a few years ago I was convinced they both hated me, this is kind of surprising." Kim snorted loudly. "They never hated you. They were a bit mad at Father, to be sure. They did admit their first actions to you were harsh, as were my own," she sighed after a second, looking briefly remorseful. "But you are our brother, a prince of the royal family. No one would deny you your place. Besides, it has been a long time since they had a little one to fuss over," Kim finished with a dark chuckle. "Xanthe said something similar," Percy sighed, placing the shell and figurine back to the boom box for the time being. "Thank you, and thank both of them for me, would you?" he said again, nodding to his sister. "Of course. I also came bearing news for the party," Kim said with another sharp grin. "Oh, gods," Percy groaned, putting his head in his hands. Kim laughed uproariously. "Oh, relax, little brother. Unfortunately, Father discovered our plans, so we're limited in what we can do," she grumbled amusedly. Not actually seeming all that mad. "To tell you the truth, I think he's just glad that we're not fighting for once," she said, sounding older than he normally pictured her. Besides, I just wanted to inform you that we've decided there is not going to be a dress code. We originally wanted to go old-timey, but Karen convinced Rhode that may not be a good idea. We wore a lot less clothes in Greek times, and I suppose that is not normal for you anymore, Kim muttered, looking slightly put out. Percy sighed in relief that he would not have to wear a chiton, and could instead go with the outfit he had planned with the help of Annabeth. Shortly after, Kim expressed her goodbyes, disappearing with a crack of storm wave with her floaty and boombox. The scent of seawater and wet wood followed her. Percy gathered up the gifts she had been given and placed them reverently in his cabin. Hopefully sometime soon he would get the chance to take Cyclone out into the water. He then changed out of his now dry PJs and into camp shirt and athletic shorts, making his way across camp towards the Athena cabin. And that is the end of Chapter 3 of The Coral Palace. I hope you all enjoyed. Sorry for the late update. I actually don't have a reason this time. I literally just forgot. I just forgot because I'm an idiot. And I would have posted this earlier, but I left this morning, I left my house this morning at 7:15, and I didn't get back until 5:30. So, yeah. And then I was like, okay, I'll do it after dinner. And so here I am, 15 minutes later. Yeah. So I think that's all I really have to say this time. Yeah, I think that's really all I have to say this time. Anyway, bye!